Alright, YouTube, it's time to talk about this blood moon tetrad that everyone's been up in arms about. It's slowly spreading all over the internet, sort of like Harold Camping's predictions did. Because people, I think, largely, regardless of what part of the world that they happen to be in, I think people understand that right now we're in a period of transformation as a world. We're in a period of violence in many cases. You see what's going on with Ukraine, Venezuela, other places, the Ebola outbreak, uh, all this stuff that you see across the world. But right now, the tetrads, as they are foretold, are being largely interpreted and misused by the apocalyptic Christian population, sort of these people that are obsessed with the idea that soon, because of some political or warmongering concept that happens to be at play, that soon the tribulation is going to come and or Jesus is going to come. There'll be the rapture and so forth. And these are the people largely that have been at work interpreting this tetrad. And of course, thus, everything that they interpret as being important related to past tetrads, they're likening to Israel, or they're likening to something to do with Jesus or the church. For instance, the Orthodox Church banning iconoclasm and then bringing iconoclasm back, things to do with the Byzantine Empire, and of course, the foundation of Israel, the Six-Day War, and so forth, and past tetrads. However, there's a mystic force at play here that most of these individuals don't understand. They may have a vague inkling of it, but they don't really understand it. Look at the occult symbol that I use on my blog, the Ouroboros surrounding the red crescent moon. Unbeknownst to me, I've been using that symbol for years now and never knew, this tetrad was going to be going on, but it is rather apt, and it does symbolically proclaim exactly what I'm about to tell everybody here, which is that this tetrad, the blood moons, again, the red crescent represented here, has to do with cycles. Cycles ending, cycles continuing, cycles renewing themselves. That's what it's all about. You can look at all sorts of ancient prophecies regarding these so-called ends, and I can go through several of these and liken them to this idea and this concept of the flow of time as being cyclical or being interconnected cycles which change over time, but they tend to repeat. Even like Dinotopia contained an aspect of this in their description of time for this other mythical world, which leads me to believe that it's quite possible that the author happened to be involved with Theosophy. The Western Abrahamist groups look at time as a line. They look at time as God creates everything, things continue on, things happen, and then it ends. And then your life may end before that, and you end, and then you either go to heaven or hell or one of purgatory or one of these other places. Essentially, you enter upon death or upon the death of the world as a whole or the universe as a whole. You enter one of these static realms, either heaven or hell, or it may be slightly different according to the specific tradition, the nature of it, and so forth, and whether it's in levels like Dante's Inferno or whatever. But the ultimate goal is to achieve one of these sort of afterlife scenarios, and it remains the same for all eternity. You never escape from that, whether it's heaven or hell. The idea of hell is eternal, heaven is you can't fall out of heaven. Many people have asked as a kid, well, what if I go to heaven and then I do something wrong? Do I then go to hell? Do I get punished somehow? And they say, no, well, you won't want to sin once you're in heaven. This linear timeline is wrong. True linear time does not exist. And the Eastern traditions, I'll point this out as well, and this includes the Norse, oddly enough, even though it's in the Western world, in the European hemisphere, in the European region, even though it's part of Europe, they had a similar view of time to some of these groups like the Hindus, which leads me to believe that there is some connection. The idea of Ragnarok departs from this, but their idea of the afterlife is similar to the Eastern traditions. When you die gloriously in battle, you go to one of these realms. The Greeks are similar with the Elysian Fields in many ways. You go to one of these sort of halls, the Hall of Odin or one of these other figures, and then every day you go out and battle. for the rest of eternity. And then you might get killed, but you'll get revived. You're already dead. And then at night you go and feast and heal your wounds and sing and get drunk and so forth. And then the next day you go out and fight again. This is sort of like their Viking, sort of very violent version of heaven, I guess. And that's what's contained within their religious dogma, or I should say spiritual dogma, not so much as an organized religion as a group of tribes practicing this tribal ethos. It's very cyclical. The idea is you go, again, you're going to a place where things don't change. They change over this sort of mini-cycle, but the entire existence is static. Rather, I believe, and other groups I think are waking up to this, there is no perpetual cycle, nor is there a line that terminates, nor is there a line that goes on forever and remains unchanged after branching a few times. Instead, existence is a complicated mechanism derived from many, many interconnected gears of cycles. The way in which they operate with each other is so large and essentially infinite in size, with an infinite amount of convolution, that it essentially becomes a random schematic. It's so complicated that there is no longer order. Yes, each cycle contains order, which can be predicted in an almost deterministic way. But when they interact with one another fully, when you look at the entire machine, the entire machination itself, it becomes disorderly because it's infinitely convoluted. It's a rather strange hypothesis to make, but this, and humor me here, it fits in with this idea of mysticism. The idea is that these prophecies that pertain to the end times, I can see this theory that I'm sure that someone else has quantified similar ideas before, the idea of an infinitely convoluted, orderly mechanism appearing disorderly. However, if you apply it to the mystic, if you apply it specifically to these end times prophecies, you can see a resemblance. The Norse end time prophecy of Ragnarok, by the way, the Vikings, so-called in the UK, already sounded the Gjallarhorn, or however you pronounce it, and declared that Ragnarok happened February 22nd of this year, and that after this is supposed to be, at some point, a metaphoric sort of 3-year winter. The Mayan calendar is the same way. In fact, the Mayan calendar most closely approximates what I'm talking about, because it becomes more and more disorderly, seemingly so, the more levels you stack upon it, even though it's actually quite orderly. It's mathematic. It's a pure mechanism. It's gears. But it appears disorderly. What I'm saying is that the end times that are predicted by the Abrahamists are misconstrued off of these original, for in their case, Roman tales of similar prophecies that do not denote that everyone suddenly enters some static, unchanging realm of hell or heaven. It doesn't say that. What it says is that temporal things on this earth come and go in cycles, predictable cycles. Empires rise and fall along a rather predictable timeline. Generally speaking, there are a few instances where this is not the case because situations change, but in general, it is fairly predictable. You look at the United States, you might apply the same thing to it and start worrying about the United States falling and hoping that it's one of those few exceptions. Personally, I think it is. I can get into that with a totally different video, but, not right now. There will be no end times, especially not simply because there is a blood moon tetrad that happens to fall on 4 Jewish holidays. It doesn't make any sense. Yes, there are cosmic and divine and spiritual energies poured down upon the earth. Yes, magic is real. All of these things that pure atheism tells you are not real are, and at least in a metaphoric or symbolic manner. However, it has nothing to do with some magical tetrad suddenly causing a plume of fire to eat the earth up. It isn't suddenly going to herald Jesus coming out of the sky with a sword sticking out of his mouth, which is amusingly what the Bible actually says. Literally he has a sword for a tongue. It's not going to happen. Number one, Jesus is dead. He's not coming back. He's not cycling. He's entered some totally other realm of existence if he ever existed in the first place. Has nothing to do with Jesus. These are misconstrued notions within all end times prophecies, and you'll note, all the ancient prophecies, Mayan calendar, Norse, Ragnarok, the Blue Kachina, all of these other prophecies, even some of the newer ones like Time Wave Zero, they talk about an end. but they do not make it clear that the end involves literally the world being utterly consumed and human life dying off for the rest of eternity. They never say that. They say there'll be misfortunes, or famines, or floods, or earthquakes, or volcanic activity, or a giant meteor, or a rain of black ash that kills a lot of people, or something, but like in Norse Ragnarok, where Frey and Freya survive and perpetuate the human race, it is simply the end of a cycle. The Hindu system is the same. Kali Yuga, which is what they consider us to be just beginning to leave right now, the Iron Age, the low age of spiritual darkness, of violence and avarice and greed and spite and all of the bad things in the world, which we are now thankfully slowly rising up out of, if you use the more accurate count, although the more inaccurate but unfortunately more widely known count says, oh, we'll be in Kali Yuga for the next, 10,000 years or something. This is, again, the result of a mistranslation. That's already been cleared up. I'm already satisfied as to the actual numbers involved. And I can try to dig up the web page where the person analyzing this, who is himself a Hindu, goes into this, and I'll try to put that in the description if I can find it at some later date. However, the system cycles. Yes, there's destruction, panic, and chaos at the bottom of the cycle. It doesn't mean that all of man gets wiped out. It doesn't mean that the earth explodes. It simply means that we've come to the end of a cycle. I was saying this about the Mayan calendar before it came to the end of its cycle. The end is not coming. The end in the sense of a mass die-off that leads to the entire depopulation of the planet will not happen in our lifetimes. Most likely, we might get smashed into by an asteroid. It's conceivable that even in the worst case scenario, some humans will survive and repopulate. A nuclear war will not kill everybody. There will be survivors. There are those who have some natural resistance to radiation, or they're in an area that just happens to be just sheltered enough for them to survive, and they'll pour out from there afterwards. People in vaults or bunkers, or vaults like in Fallout, or bunkers or whatever. A mass die-off due to some like Stephen King's The Stand style Ebola outbreak or zombie virus. There will be survivors. The world will go on. There will be an end of human life on the Earth someday. It won't be because of a blood moon tetrad. It's not going to happen. The significance of the tetrad is change. Change from one cycle to a next. Even some cults are intelligent enough to understand. Look at Heaven's Gate. Crazy bald dude, Marshall Applewhite, tells his followers to drink, cyanide Kool-Aid. I don't know if that was Jonestown was the cyanide Kool-Aid. They drank some sort of poison, and I think it was actually cyanide-laced vodka in the case of Heaven's Gate, if I remember correctly. Don't quote me on that. And they all put on their blue robes and got into bed and died. This is sort of their really weird, sort of superstitious take on this Halley's Comet movement, or Hale-Bopp, I believe, this cometary movement. They thought the end was coming. They had to transverse to a different dimensional plane or some weird New Age hippie shit like that. And so they killed themselves. But even they understood the concept was to leave one cyclical existence for another, for one that was higher or more pure or more bountiful in some way. I don't recommend that people, kill themselves because a comet goes past, but at least they marginally understood this concept. The Easterners with their static cycles and the Westerners with their linear time are both equally wrong. You have to look at it as a mechanism composed of an infinite number of cycles. Then it begins to make sense. Then you begin to understand why things appear random. They're not. But at the same time, they kind of are, because there's no way you can ever fathom the entire cycle, so even if it's deterministic, to you it's still random. It doesn't even require a god to exist. It's the movement of particles and cosmic forces in relation to one another. They interact with one another. A deterministic universe based on the Big Bang and every atom going in a certain direction at a certain speed with a certain energy value and so forth, I don't believe in. I think it's much more complicated than that. And I do believe in spiritual forces. But I believe that they too, whether they operate on this dimension or the next, or some other weird dimension or astroplane or whatever you might drag into it with your hippy-trippy stuff, they interact with one another, even across dimensions. But to make it simple, this blood moon tetrad does not herald the return of Jesus, the tribulation, or the end of the world. Not as it is envisioned by Judeo-Christianity or Islam. Islam has similar idea with Dajjal. Dajjal, or the Zoroastrian with Ahriman, which is basically the same character. The Arab Muslims ripped it off of the Zoroastrians they encountered. We all know that as well. It's not the end of the world. It's the end of a cycle. The end of probably a particularly long, important cycle that, again, we can't really read much into because we can't fully predict the future. We can sort of get a vague idea of these cycles and what's likely to happen. For instance, we know it's December in the Northern Hemisphere. It's likely to get cold and start snowing. It's June in the Northern Hemisphere. It's likely to be warm. Plants will start to grow. Well, that's more in May and April, but you know what I mean. We can get that, but then there could be a freak snowstorm on the 4th of July. There could be a week of nonstop 80 degrees in the middle of winter. We can't fully predict it. All we can do is give it some sort of mathematic principle and say, well, it's likely or it's unlikely, and we can sort of map things out, but not entirely. These people, these charlatans, that are trying to sell you books and get money from you because they say the end is nigh, here's what you need to do, pray this, stock up on these goods, blah, blah, blah. They're all a bunch of charlatans. Even by the ideas of their own so-called Lord Jesus, they're going to hell for being posers. They don't even believe in the actual Jesus. I've spoken about that many times. No, the end is not coming because the moon decides to take on a reddish hue because of some sort of eclipse. Nor does it have anything to do with Mars being in opposition to the Earth and Sun yesterday night. No, the world is not ending. Not in the strict sense. Do things come to an end? Well, George Harrison, all things must pass. Yes, it's true. Everything will come to an end. You'll die someday. Does that mean that you suddenly disappear? Some say yes. I personally believe no. However, on this world, I don't believe it's anywhere near time that we're all going to be depopulated by some catastrophic event. Unless man really applies himself, then he might persevere in destroying all human life. Nature does not seem ready to do that yet. Doesn't matter how many 10.0 earthquakes you have, it doesn't matter if Yellowstone blows up. People will persist. Would it be a major happening? Would it be a major cataclysm? Yes. But some would survive. Human life would go on, unchanged from before, and it would persevere, probably for another few million years. It's rather optimistic. Some people say that's optimistic and naive. That is what I believe, based on my own reading into of the occult, the mystic, all of these prophetic statements, and just studying a little bit about science, which sort of governs the way things on this earth work. That's about all. Peace out.